Hey, it's Broken Office Chair, a podcast produced by Alternatives. Broken Office Chair is hosted by Alternatives Executive Director Bessie Alcantara. Bessie is a Chicago native, first-generation Salvadoran Mexican-American who's passionate about dismantling systemic racism. In each episode, Bessie will be joined by her friends and colleagues who are ready to speak candidly about their experiences as people of color in their various professions. In the episodes, they'll address topics such as issues in the nonprofit sector, racial equity, DEI in practice, and much, much more.
Today, we are joined by two organizers from US-Palestine Community Network, also known as UPCN, Nick and Nazek. Nick, see, I'm already butchering it. Nick Seuss is an organizer with the US-Palestinian Community Network and former co-chair of the Chicago chapter during the Justice for Razmia campaign. Nazek is current chair of the Chicago chapter of USPCN and co-chair of the Coalition to March on the DNC. She is one of the leaders of USPCN's campaign to challenge the hypocrisy of progressives except on Palestine, like U.S. Congresswoman Jen Schakowsky. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So I found y'all on Instagram. I was watching a speech by, I think it was a valedictorian at, is it CUNY Law School in New York? Mm-hmm. And from watching the backlash that she got, I somehow ended up finding y'all. So why don't we kick it off by you telling us a little bit about your work at USPCN?
Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
So USPCN is a community-based organization that is focused on the Arab community. Our chapter in Chicago obviously works within the city of Chicago as well as the southwest suburbs where a majority of our community is, and mobilizing the community in regards to Palestine and providing advocacy and holding elected officials accountable on Palestine. But we also do a lot of solidarity work with our Black allies for police accountability and stopping police crimes, working within immigrant rights groups and supporting their work and other communities as well.
That was a really good nutshell. So let's just jump in. Since October 7th, that's the loaded question, right? Since October 7th, what have you been seeing that you may have not been seeing before? Or has nothing changed?
Regarding like from the community,
yeah.
Or we're 11 months into the genocide, and so I think we saw the immediate reactions from the community that we want to be out in the streets and we want to be fighting for our liberation and stopping the massacres that are occurring in Gaza and that have the attacks have been expanding into the West Bank because we know that. This did not start October 7th.
Right. Palestine
has been under occupation, military occupation, for 76 years. And so this is just a continuation of the horrific Zionist genocidal state of Israel and the occupation it's been waging against Palestine, the Palestinian people. And so people were ready. And I think we've seen that because we've been able to mobilize 50 mass protests under the Coalition for Justice in Palestine almost weekly since this has started. And so I think that's one way for people to really express a lot of the frustrations, a lot of the disappointment, and the sadness and grief that we're collectively experiencing is through these protests and these actions that we've been holding.
Have you been seeing increased opposition or increased hate
to our protests since I think we've seen the narrative shift since October 7th. Historically, Palestine was a taboo word. A lot of folks that are Palestinian would not identify as Palestinian, maybe publicly if they did not feel safe in a certain space, whether school or at their jobs. And so I think we've seen some of that narrative shift to not only are we saying Palestine, but we're saying free Palestine. We as in like a collective society.
Yeah.
Because Arabs and Palestinians have been saying this from the beginning. And so the Zionists, I think, and the racist haters that have always been hating on Palestine are always hating on Palestine and Palestinians. So I think they have continued to do so, through the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, the Jewish United Fund, JUF, and they have tried to label any sort of sentiment of support for Palestine as anti-Semitic, which is typically the tool that they use or attempt to use to disenfranchise the Free Palestine movement.
And then just to add on to that as well, like the ADL has actually issued statements calling USPCN and a lot of the Palestinian organizations out for their quote unquote anti-Semitism. And in a lot of ways, many people have come out to like challenge and discredit that, to say like these people are calling for an end to a genocide. They're not calling for anti-Semitism towards any person, towards any Jewish community or individual. This is specifically saying stop the bombardment, stop killing Palestinians. There are over 40,000 dead. They've been identified in the ICJ as a plausible genocide being committed in Gaza. So it, like Nazek had said, the narrative has definitely shifted when it comes to the issue of Palestine and the Palestinian Liberation Movement.
And we know that the ADL and the JUF, historically, they are racist institutions. They are fear-mongering institutions under the guise of social justice. They try to align themselves with social justice movements to make a point. And they're historically anti-Black, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian, and anti-Muslim. And so they have no sort of like creditation in our book because of that.
It's funny, because I've seen some of the statements calling out specific organizations, and one of the ones that always amuses me a little bit is that they call out Jewish Voice for Peace as anti-Semitic. And I was like, they're literally Jewish.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting to me. One of the things for us, I think that came up a lot, and I wanted to touch on this after you brought this, the relationships across communities, because one of the things that we also found really interesting when we started talking on the topic, alternatives, I mentioned earlier, I'm Latina. We're predominantly Black and brown, as in Latinx type of brown usually. And so we got a lot of backlash for our stance, and folks feeling like it wasn't a topic that was relevant to us. And so one of the things that was also really interesting to me, which is a little bit of what you cover, is that some of the institutions that supported us were progressive until we said Palestine.
Absolutely.
And then all of a sudden, and I thought our statements, because I let my partner read it. And, he grew up in India, so he doesn't have our lens per se. So I let him read it, and he's like, this statement is pretty neutral. And so he felt like it was neutral. But then we got this huge backlash to it, and people feeling like we did not present a balanced point of view and all these different things. And so that's why I ask if you've seen an increase in opposition towards y'all, or in any other sort of avenue. Or maybe I'm seeing an increase because we're talking about it. I don't know.
Yeah.
I can say that we have seen opposition, but we've definitely seen a lot more people in support. We've had people, on our social media too, like Zionist comments, and people coming in from their personal accounts, just random people we've never even known before, may have been at our protest, just commenting, saying like, this has nothing to do with what you're talking about right now, or whatever, like challenging them in many different ways in the discussion. And that's more so of what I'm seeing, is that even though we may be seeing the ADL challenging and calling us anti-Semitic during the DNC, prior to the DNC, they actually issued a statement saying that we're bringing anti-Semitism to Chicago, and this is going to be like a terrible thing for the Jewish community, and nothing has happened of that nature through the week. And it's never happened through our almost weekly protests that we've done in coalition every single week to build up. Like we do see that, we do see people trying to challenge us on our narrative and on our messaging and what we're calling for and our demands, but it's clearly not as effective as it used to be in the past.
Can we talk about this a little bit, this anti-Semitic thing for a second? Because a lot of information right now, I think, is coming through social media.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the conversations that I've been seeing on social media is that Palestinians are also Semites, so you can't technically be anti-Semitic. Is that accurate?
I mean, I don't think that's the argument that we use for it. I mean,
I'm just curious because I've been seeing it pop up a lot.
Sure.
Yeah.
Is it like Semitic people are of the like
just from a
area.
Historical
Yeah.
lesson.
Yeah. Yep. I think they like fall under that lens.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But there is real anti-Semitism in this world.
Right.
We know that, and we see it, and it's horrific. And labeling Palestinian liberation movements, labeling any sort of support for Palestine and the rights of Palestinians as anti-Semitic really takes away from the real anti-Semitism that is happening in this world. Because just because someone is saying Free Palestine does not mean anything about it does not impact anything about, Jewish people. It is about the liberation of the people that have been under occupation for 75 years. And by labeling anything that says Palestinians should be free from the river to the sea, which is historic Palestine, it doesn't make sense.
I also, so the argument is that saying from river to the sea, and I dug deep in social, I got down the rabbit hole one day with this particular topic, the from the river to the sea. So that reference is that it came from this idea, apparently a group used it, that meant for it to mean to kill all Jews. True or not true?
We don't believe in that. That's not what our chant from the river to the sea means, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. That is historic Palestine. And so we are calling for all Palestinian refugees and their descendants in the diaspora to have the ability to return to their historic homes and lands.
Let's walk through that for a second, because one of the things, and we've had a couple of folks on here talking about this particular issue, specifically as well from the Jewish perspective, because I always think that you kind of have to challenge your own a little bit. But we also wanted to have the Palestinian perspective. One of the things that I've talked about significantly is how we purposefully in this country keep folks uneducated on what happened in Palestine, right? So I always talk about my own personal experience that I was in Israel, and I took my mom to Israel. We grew up Catholic, and so my mom was really excited to see the birthplace of Jesus, etc. And then I hit up a friend who's Arabic, and he was like, "What are you doing in the modern day apartheid?" was what he said. I was like, "What are you talking about?" And that was my introduction to Palestine and digging deep into what was happening. And I got to spend some time in the West Bank, etc. And so when we say that this occupation has been happening for over 70 years, can we get I know this is challenging, but can we get a quick history of what it is that we're referencing? Because when we were getting the backlash, some of what we got is, this is not an occupation. This is the Jews' natural, this is our original homeland, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So can we just get a quick what you're referencing?
Sure. Historical synopsis. Yeah,
I know, right?
you got more than
How much time do we have to talk about? So starting off, when the State of Israel was created in 1948, there was there weren't nearly as many Jewish people living in what was the British Mandated Palestine. Many of those Jewish people identified as Palestinians themselves. Having family who were around in 1948, our next door neighbors, I came to find out, were actually Jewish Palestinians who fought off Israeli soldiers and told them that our home was a Jewish home and to not invade it. And they did wind up doing that after like 6 months. We came to find out from them when my grandparents returned to the home. That's what was told of them, that like we tried to fight them off and tell them that this was a Jewish home, and eventually they figured it out. And so like looking at that, that's what started it all. And then the mass migration from Europe, which came even before 1948, that started happening. After 1948, it was just a lot more migration into what we refer to as the 1948 territories, what others may refer to as Israel. They've come into, they've come into their masses. They've displaced Palestinians, many of whom have escaped by the threat of life. They've escaped to go into other neighboring countries like Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. Many have come to America and other countries around the world, and that has progressed ever since 1948.
I want to clarify something that you inferred, and that's a lot of these borders, when we're talking about Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, et cetera, a lot of these borders are imposed.
Yes.
They did not exist. And so I think that folks also have to draw the parallel to colonization here, because
Definitely.
Our borders are also imposed.
Yeah.
And I want to clarify that, when we're talking about that in 1948 specifically, there was the Nakba, which is the catastrophe that happened, which led to the mass exodus of Palestinians forcibly removed from their homes through massacres. There are entire villages that were massacred by Zionists specifically. So there's a difference between Zionism and Judaism. What the state of Israel does is tries to tie them to be one thing, so that any sort of criticism of the political state of Israel implies then criticism of Jewish people or hatred towards Jewish people. That's not the case. Those are completely separate things. Zionism is a political ideology, and it was Zionist forces that committed the Nakba, massacring villages, forcibly removing people from their homes, and many of the things that Nick had referred to when he was talking about it as well. So just want to add that in for context as we're talking about this.
Yeah.
And so from 1948 to now, what have we been seeing?
Colonization.
Yeah.
Call
it what it is.
Yeah.
The short step of what it is, it's colonization of Palestinian land that has been going on since then. We've also seen what the international community has now identified as apartheid. Something Palestinians have been saying for decades on decades is just now something being recognized. Palestinians are only allowed to travel on Palestinian-only roadways, and those have military checkpoints and screenings that people need to go through, making things even more difficult for travel. You do get some people saying that, there are, they call them Arab Israelis, but Palestinians living in the 1948 territories who are considered quote-unquote equal citizens. But what they don't identify or recognize is the situation that those quote-unquote equals actually have a much more difficult time getting permits to build property, getting permits to open up businesses. Those types of actions are intentional. A story that I had heard of when I have actually gone to Palestine and gone on a delegation was, for example, in the city of Nazareth, which is in 1948, Palestinians were trying to get building permits to make repairs for their homes, and the city, I think it was constantly denying it, which is an Israeli-run city. And eventually, what they winded up doing was buying up new homes that were created in Israeli settlements that were supposed to be for the Jewish community, that were and Zionists specifically, who were coming as immigrants to our land, and they started purchasing that property. And when the Zionists who were already living there were complaining that Arabs were coming into their neighborhood and this was not good for them, they finally started approving those permits to repair those properties in the city of Nazareth. And for Palestinians, we don't need to be around Zionists. So that was a move that was made by the community to challenge, to be well, if you're saying we can't do this here, we're going to go right in your face in front of all these other Zionists you don't want us there, and we're gonna, do what we have to. And that winded up going in their favor. But that sort of addresses the situation and assumption that people, or claim that people say that like those who live in 1948 have equal status. That's not even true. In addition to the rest of the West Bank and other restrictions that you see in Gaza as well.
So the one thing that just came up for me, because you said immigrants that are coming in, right? And I think that's a really strong point to highlight that folks don't realize, is that the state of Israel is comprised by a lot of folks who are not originally from there.
Yep.
It's most of the population.
Right. And most of, from what I've seen, the cabinet, the leadership of Israel, et cetera, because the state of Israel has said anybody who is Jewish can come live here.
Yeah.
And on the flip side, if you're Palestinian, you have no right of return.
Absolutely.
And so what is it, 7 million Palestinians that are currently displaced, I read?
I don't know what the official number is. But
Yeah, I think
it's a large amount.
It's a large
It
amount.
is a very large amount.
And so this conversation has been coming up a lot because there is a couple of folks, right? And again, I go down the rabbit hole of social media to kind of see how folks are thinking. Saying then why don't Palestinians just leave is one argument. And then another one is why don't Arabic countries open up their borders to take Palestinians in?
I think I can answer both of those.
Please go ahead.
Why don't Palestinians just leave? Because the colonizers win at that point.
That's why I bring up the right of return too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, there are we all know there are Palestinians who are still living in Palestine that have no interest of coming to America. My family's situation, there was some situations that caused it to happen, but I have family who are in Palestine right now who come visit us all the time, and they literally will say there's nothing like Palestine, and I will stay there. And even though it's living under occupation, even though they're living under restriction and constant policing and surveillance from the state of Israel, they're dedicated to staying in their homeland. That's property. I think that's like a Palestinian thing where like when we own land, we hold on to that. Maybe this is like a person of color thing.
It's a person of color because I've talked to so many folks of different cultures, and the arguments, and in Spanish we call it terrenos, the argument for land, like who owns what land, how much land, how you pass it out down.
Goes back generations.
Yeah. Yes. And then I hear from my partner that the same thing in India, how much land you own, acres, et cetera. So I think it is a person of color thing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then with regards to like other Arab nations accepting Palestinians, like that's just acknowledging that these people do have a right to this land. You're saying that like, well, in order for us to expand, we have to push people out. That's what you're acknowledging when you say that, when you ask that question. And the second thing is that why should another nation have to accept people who, one, don't want to leave, and two, shouldn't even have to leave in the first place?
Right.
So that's the direct response to that.
I do think that there is an element, and when you're making these arguments, I feel like folks aren't necessarily listening to logic, but I do like to just entertain the questions sometimes to see if there is a little bit of possibility. But
I think there's also just like on a basic level, there's also just anti-Palestinian sentiment and like inherent there's like a lot of Islamophobia just like in this culture and society, whether or not people are conscious of that. And so not all Palestinians are Muslim. We know this, right? Jesus is from Palestine. Jesus is Christian. But I think there's a lot of that just below the surface for people that it doesn't occur to them. So I think that could sometimes also be at play inherently when thinking about the Palestine as a whole.
It's also, you brought up something that I think is also really important, which is like some of your family just is not interested in leaving, but also not interested in coming to the U.S. And this is a really fun argument between me and my partner because he's like, U.S. is not as great as you think it is, right? And so like I always talk about, like, my mom fled a war. I don't think she would have left if her country was not in war.
Would anybody leave their home country if there was no war?
But we're fed this narrative from a young age that U.S. is the best country. It's the land of freedom. It's the land of opportunity. And so that narrative feeds into, why don't people just leave and go to a Western nation and live happily ever after kind of idea.
Yeah. I mean,
if people are willing to live in an apartheid conditions as opposed to coming to the U.S., you could that is a good summation of where the U.S. really stands on the global scale.
I think a lot of folks would not leave their country of origin if there wasn't political instability, typically caused by the U.S. and its allies. Thinking of my own parents that are from Lebanon, same kind of thing. I know many people from South America as well. Political instability. They would have loved to stay in their home country.
Absolutely. And with that being said, it's very, in Latino culture, it's actually very common for folks to come here, work, and retire back home.
Yeah.
So going back to that land that people own, right? Going back to that land and retiring back at home.
I was part of a research study, and we found that with the first migration of Palestinians that came to Chicago specifically, it was mostly men that were coming and working, and the goal was to go back home. And so they'd come here and work. This was in the early 1900s. Come and work and then go back home. And eventually they had to bring their families, or they were no longer allowed to go back home. And so they had to make the choice of, are we staying here or are we going back to Palestine? So even 100 years ago.
Right. Yeah. And
I was going to say, even more recently, I have an uncle who is retired now, and he constantly growing up would tell us, like, as soon as my kids are good to go to college, I'm going back to Palestine. And he did not have, he had what was identified as, we call it Jerusalem ID, which it's essentially a green card allowing you to live in the city of Jerusalem. But if you're gone for too long, you lose it.
Oh.
So he came here in the 90s. And obviously we're in 2024. So he's definitely outside the scope of, I think it's like Israel acknowledges, like, I think if you're outside more than 7 years, I think the number is, they basically are like, you're not eligible to come back and live here at all. So he's well beyond that. But he always would say, like, when my kids are fully grown, gone to college, all set, I'm going to retire and go back to Palestine. And, unfortunately, he wasn't able to do that. And still isn't able to do that right now, but
my mom even has her place in El Salvador to be buried in. Yeah. So that's always been the goal.
Yeah.
And people, it's interesting. I think that if you don't have that cultural narrative, it's harder for folks to understand. I'm actually going to bring that up to my partner later, because I'm assuming he wants to be buried in India and I would be buried here. So this should be interesting. That's the only way he's going to get away from me, apparently. So earlier, you kind of going back to something you said earlier that I still want to make sure that we get. You talked about your involvement with other groups and supporting their rights. And so for you, both of you, what is the similarities between what you see with Black rights, Latinx, et cetera, immigrant rights, and Palestine?
I'll take working with our Black allies. So USPCN has a very close relationship with the Black community, specifically the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Oppression, and their national organization too. We have been working together. The Palestinian community has been working together with the Black community even since as far back as the 70s, if not further. And Palestinians and Arabs in general, like, actually worked hard on Harold Washington's election campaign as well, to get the first Black mayor in Chicago. So that relationship has been well developed prior to me and Nazek ever being in these spaces or alive even. But we have a very close relationship, and we recognize that, Palestinian liberation is not going to be achieved without Black liberation. We saw many parallels, like when, for example, when Mike Brown was murdered by the police in St. Louis, Palestinians in Gaza were giving pointers of how to deal with tear gas to the Black community. And that is something that the Black community saw and used those tools and experience for their own struggle when they're getting tear gassed and whatnot by the police.
There was a delegation from Palestine. I can't remember if it was the West Bank or I think it was the West Bank of folks that came to St. Louis to hold the line with activists that were there after the murder of Mike Brown.
Yeah. So, and we also recognize, in the city of Chicago, for example, for the longest time had relationships with the state of Israel where they would send the police out there to train. And the tactics and practices that the state of Israel used to surveil and police the Palestinian community is something that's brought here to the U.S. to many police agencies across the country, not just in Chicago. So we recognize that our targeted enemy and people that we want to challenge for actual change, that is something that it is a unified effort, that because when you bring down the apartheid state of Israel and hold it accountable for all of the genocide and every crime that it's ever committed against the Palestinian people, you're also holding account the system that upholds suppression of Black people in the U.S. It's also the same system that deals with that wants a wall built on the southern border of the U.S. Yep. Those are the types of things that we see that link all these causes together, that push us to also support our allies in their fight for liberation as well.
Do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, the surveillance piece at the border, right, and ICE. So it's not only the police departments locally and nationally, but a lot of that surveillance is developed in Israel and used against the Palestinians by the Israeli occupation forces, the IOF, and then it's used here to militarize the border, which is I think we know how we feel about the border,
right?
The southern border, human-imposed border. Against people that are fleeing their countries of origin that are war-torn and are that way because of U.S. intervention. And so these systems intertwine and are brutalizing our communities as Black and brown people. Although the face might be different, they are all connected. And like Nick said, our liberation struggles are connected. And when we liberate Palestine, we know that we are going to continue fighting for the liberation of Black folks, the liberation of Chicano folks, and all liberation movements until all of us are free. The work does not stop.
At all. I have 17 million questions, but she just flagged my timing. So let's talk about that specifically, liberation. There are a couple of conversations, particularly amongst the progressives and quotations right now happening around what this looks like. There is the conversation around a ceasefire with no other, addressing no other system that currently exists. There is the conversation around two-state solution. What does liberation look like to you?
Yeah. I can speak on behalf of, our line as an organization. We believe in a one-state solution that is pluralistic, that is that is secular, so not a religious state, that everybody can live. That's what we believe in. We don't believe in a two-state solution. We believe in a one secular state, pluralistic society, with the right of return for all Palestinians and their descendants.
And then one thing
and refugees. Sorry.
Yeah, yes. And then one thing I'll bring up about the call for two-state solution. It is from its roots a colonialist ideology that Palestinians and hopefully they won't be Zionists, but Jewish people can't live amongst each other like we have prior to 1948.
Right.
That is a colonialist ideology and mindset of it. It's something that is achievable, and if the Zionists who are there who decide that they're going to continue to be rabid Zionists, well, that's not what would be expected in a liberated Palestine. There can and will be Jewish people, just like there can and will be Christian people and Muslim people and people of all faiths and backgrounds and religions that can live in Palestine.
And did historically live in Palestine for centuries.
And have historically done it. And so that's something that people always say it's not achievable. It was achievable in 1947.
Right.
It was achievable in the 1800s. It was achievable throughout history.
Yeah.
And with regards to ceasefire, we are way beyond the call for ceasefire at this point. There have been over 40,000. Now the estimated total, the official number that hasn't been updated in a pretty long while because they destroyed the Gaza Health Ministry, was 40,000. And the estimate total that they're at now are saying more along the lines of 180,000 people who were murdered.
Based on the Lancet, I don't think it was a study, but the Lancet the Lancet article and review. I'm sorry. They were estimating, this was a month ago?
Yeah.
Upwards of 180,000 people. And so
that's about 10% of the population, right? Yeah.
2 million people, yeah.
Yep. So when they say, when Kamala Harris, for example, went up on stage during the DNC and was just like, we are working diligently for a ceasefire, we're way beyond a call for that. Like, we need an end to military aid. We need the U.S. to stop vetoing UN Security Council votes. We need the U.S. to actually take a stance against the genocide that's happening. Because what they're doing now is they're sending billions and billions of dollars to the state of Israel and weapons and saying we're fighting for a ceasefire. I'm pretty sure when you stop sending the bombs, when you stop sending those free bombs too, not just sending bombs, when you stop sending those free bombs that we're paying for, Israel will have a different tone in what they realize they're doing and they're complicit in what the genocide that they're committing against our people. That's the bottom line when it comes to the ceasefire. Like, at this point, Democrats have made it a sexy word that they realize people want to hear. And we're way beyond the call for that.
Yeah. I love to travel. And because I am, for some reason, a morbid traveler, one of my favorite things to do is visit places that have a really intense history. And so I keep going back to Rwanda, which is one of the places I really wanted to see up close because of the movie. But in there was a conversation of how many acts of genocide does it take to call it genocide? And so that's what it makes me think about when talking about the Democratic Party, because they can acknowledge all of these facts and still will just step away from acknowledging how bad it actually is.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's so entrenched, I think, in the Democratic Party. Obviously, the Republican Party, there's no hope there for many of our rights.
As a 501c3, I cannot promote either party.
No, I understand.
Of course.
But especially with the Democrats who are in power right now, and the administration was Joe Biden, that we lovingly call Genocide Joe Biden, and Killer Kamala Harris. They have had every opportunity to not send bombs to massacre children and fathers and mothers and grandparents and all the atrocities that we see daily in our social media feeds. And they haven't. And so,
What would be your call to action for folks who are listening?
All your listeners out there?
For our listeners, yep.
I think letting your voice be heard, coming out to our rallies, to when we have mass numbers, we make bigger statements. We've had a good amount of people coming out to our protests. I would also say constantly make every elected person who is complicit in this genocide, similar to Jan Schakowsky.
Which is everybody at this point.
Yes.
The ones who are speaking out have been pushed out. So
make their lives miserable by holding them accountable every step of the way. You see them at a coffee shop, call them out for what they are. There's a point where we actually heard, we went and disrupted a fundraiser for Dick Durbin, and somebody who was at the event, one of our members who was a part of the disruption, was walking out. He was just there to record, and overheard somebody telling another person, these are the same people who have been doing this to Jan Schakowsky, and now Jan Schakowsky won't even do public events anymore. So it's working. They're hearing our message whether they like to or not, and like it won't make a difference if they stay in hiding. We did a car caravan outside of Dick Durbin's house and stopped outside of Dick Durbin's house, and coincidentally he was there that day, and we caught him off guard completely. So there's, not hosting public fundraisers is not going to stop us from calling you out every step of the way whenever we see you.
Yeah, they're complicit through and through. Not saying anything or saying, oh, two sides is not, that's complicity. For the listeners out there, I think an important thing that they can do is to keep talking about Palestine, keep uplifting what is happening in Gaza, what is happening in the West Bank, and show up in the ways that you can. If you're able to show up to a rally, we welcome that. If you are not able to do that, donate to an organization that is supporting the Palestinian Liberation Movement, as well as, orgs that are doing humanitarian aid, fundraising as well. Keep talking about it with family, with friends, with loved ones. That is our duty here, is to continue to uplift and not turn away 11 months in.
Yeah. Where can folks find you online?
Yeah. The U.S. Palestinian Community Network, USPCN. They can find us on Facebook, on Twitter, and as well as Instagram, and uspcn.org.
All right. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having us.
To keep up with everything going on at Alternatives or to donate, you can visit us at our website, alternativesyouth.org. You can also follow us at Alternatives Inc. on Instagram or at Alternatives Youth on Facebook. If you want to keep up with Bessie, you can follow her on Instagram and TikTok at Bessie_Alcantara. Thanks for listening.